Hello, strangers. It's Tuesday, and that means another true scary story you won't hear anywhere else. This one comes from a family friend. It's story number 116. I'm a cop. Long ago, I started in this remote little podunk up in the mountains. It was the only place I could get a job fresh out of the academy. I'd been doing that job for nearly 2 years when this happened. At near 2 years, I still wasn't anywhere close to seniority. That meant I got stuck on the overnights. They were the only time slots I could get a shift. Says something about how sure I wanted to be police, that I stuck with it, I guess. In our small town, the local economy was bolstered by the lumber industry and the paper mill. Factory workers and lumberjacks, you don't get much more mountain man blue collar, and those boys were firm believers in work hard, play harder. That meant policing a chaotic stretch of bars and pubs along what I suppose could be referred to as the main drag, in that it had a whopping 3 of our town's 5 stoplights. The bars had goofy names like the Pretty Pitcher, but the insides were no joke. Dingy, dark, redolent of cigarette and pipe smoke, with a gummy, sticky film that seemed to glisten on any surface, to include your own body if you stayed in there for any amount of time. And while there were nights when people were happy drunks, you'd know it before you even swung the door open, because someone would have begun a round of shanties, and the bar's occupants were making up for what they lacked in tonality with what they could produce in volume. Yeah, while there were some nights that were good, fun, and your only role as a local cop was to tip your hat and to tell them to get home safe, there were the other nights when it was like a skunk had wandered into the town. Only instead of the stench of its spray, it was bad temper being released into the air, and the men in themselves who were sour, angry, edgy, violent. And on one of those terrible nights, when the sky itself was starless and dark, like the night itself was in a pissy mood, I was already crossing myself as I followed my partner, McCurdy, into the swinging saloon doors of the Elbow Room, because this wasn't my first rowdy fight to break up. Not by a long chalk. But something in the sound, the tremor of voices swelling in senseless rage, something was up. Something was making the back of my neck prickle in anticipation of something worse than usual. I couldn't say what. Perhaps that old yarn about police training a gut instinct to a level nearing prescience. But as my feet thunked along the solid wood planks of the porch, then the foyer, if such a place as the Elbow Room could be said to have something as delicate sounding as a foyer, well, this drumbeat of a bad heart was just thudding, just under the din of the crowd. Oh God, the crowd. The bar was alive. Everywhere you looked, something was moving. Men's faces red, their arms shiny in the sticky, humid air. You ever kick a rock over and see black beetles and worms, shiny and startled, start wriggling and scampering away? It was the same that night. Only in lieu of beetles, we had Billies, Bobbies, and Bruces. The voices were loud, and while individual words blended into one loud, angry male voice that babbled, spiked, and rose, the message was received loud and clear. Tear them apart, gut them where they stand. We are apoplectic with rage. We will only stop when there's been enough blood to quench our thirst. The tinkling of glass, bottles smashing on counters and floor, rang like bells skimming over the rumble of angry men. It's the last place anyone who had half a brain would want to be. But the job's the job. And McCurdy and I waded in, adding our own voices to the din, calling out, "Police! Police! Stop it!" Our hands were outstretched, latching hold of jackets and shoulders and pulling people apart. We were none too gracious about it, but desperate times. That sound of breaking glass, well, it could be highballs and tumblers falling to the sticky, crusty floor. But it could also be bottles, smashed deliberately on the counter to produce makeshift, jagged shivs. The sooner we could separate all the combatants, the less likely someone would catch a broken bottle in the gut. It was bad that night, worse than I ever saw before. There were, of course, the rabble-rousers you could count on in there, the guys who seemed to come preloaded with a short fuse and a desire to fight. And sure enough, I spotted their faces in the throng. But there were unusual faces that night, too. Men we knew as calm, rational, their features unrecognizable, snarling with rage. My heart was sinking, because that bad feeling was spiking as I laid eyes on one man who, in my mind, would never have raised a hand to anyone. The town's clerk and notary. I'd never seen his mouth set in more than a disapproving flat line, but now he bared his teeth, eyes glinting under lowered eyebrows, as he seemed to scan around for something. Someone. Anyone foolish enough to make eye contact and catch his anger. His eyes locked onto mine. My heart stopped, even before, from below, his arm raised. In his hand, he held a dull black handgun. I opened my mouth, filling my lungs with that awful thick burgoo of air to scream out, but I wasn't quick enough. Because McCurdy, my partner, he saw the movement somehow in that mob, and before I could even blink, he had charged through the bodies, and right in front of the bang. In that tiny, dingy bar, even with that noise, the report of the handgun sliced clean through the sound. It was deafening, and as time slowed, I saw men drop to the ground, instinctually unclenching their fists to clap their hands over their ears. In slow motion, I saw the mild-mannered clerk's face change, like all the anger fell off his face, slick and slimy with sweat. He looked down the length of his own arm, seeming horrified to discover the smoking gun held in his own hand. His eyes slid off, down to the floor. Mine followed. McCurdy was on the ground. McCurdy wasn't moving, save a sludgy pool of deep black red spilling from under his head. He'd fallen forward, and only a quarter of the side of his face was visible to me. I could see his eye, half open, gazing out at nothing at all. From behind me, fresh shouts. Our backup had arrived, but too late. I didn't have time to talk to them. I didn't have the words. I was on McCurdy in an instant, pulling him up, praying mindlessly to God above, even as I knew from the dead weight of him. And I was outside. Without remembering how, I now crouched in the snow, the shock of outside air in my lungs as my knees sank into the cold. I was holding McCurdy. I cradled him in my arms, his head on my lap. My lungs hurt. My face was wet. Sweat, tears, even a spray of blood from my partner whose pupils reflected the black sky back to me, the left side of whose forehead now bore another pupil, a hole from which bubbled frothy red. The clerk had shot him in the head. I hadn't seen an exit wound, but from the murmur around me I was hearing .22. Small caliber. Bullet may not have had the power to punch through. It may still be in. How will I tell his wife? That's what I remember thinking, so hard it came out of my mouth, me asking a question to my fallen partner. How am I going to explain this to Mandy? Someone was trying to pull me away from him. EMTs in their coveralls leaning over us, and as they leaned on me, and I momentarily leaned closer to McCurdy, I could swear I heard his voice. "What about Mandy?" The world stopped spinning. I stared down at McCurdy. Instead of that blank, empty gaze into the sky, I found his eyes staring right back at mine. And then he winced. My freaking head! If the volume of that fight had seemed loud, well, it was nothing compared to the shrieks and shouts from around me. All at once, I was hauled up and away from my partner as the EMTs swarmed. The cops around me were asking over and over, "Is he alive? How? He was shot! He was shot in the head!" I had no answers. I had no words at all. I looked at my hands as if expecting the blood to disappear, but it remained grimed into the lines of my palms. I looked up to the black sky, and I swear, it sounds crazy, but I swear it on my life. In that dark sky, I saw one star blaze into light like someone above had lit a match. The official report was a lot less willing to believe in miracles. The small caliber bullet had hit my partner, had even penetrated the skin of his lined forehead, but in a 1 in a million chance, it had hit at just the right angle to skim alongside the top of the bone of his skull and not puncture through. Like a cat under a blanket, it had raced around the side of his head under the skin, only exiting in the hairline by his ear, not where anyone would expect to see an exit wound. In fact, a few stitches later, and the man I'd watched be shot in the head was back at work, neat little white gauze bandages, and 2 wicked black eyes. He'd face-planted when he'd passed out. Well, those were the only sign that anything had happened at all. Well, that and the throng of reporters. Oh, the local papers swarmed. They even had someone come out from the county seat. And with an impertinence that nearly drove me to rage myself, I could tell that they were disappointed in the relative tameness of the photos they took of my partner. And the man himself, he seemed embarrassed by the attention. Not that I helped. I had this horrible suspicion, an echo of that bad feeling from that night, that there was still something ticking, waiting. While we were all celebrating his survival, had the bullet bruised something? Had it caused blood to pool and set the wheels in motion for a stroke, a blood clot, an aneurysm? I found myself repeatedly, compulsively thanking him. It was as though if I expressed enough gratitude, I could charm away the bad luck that I sensed coming. I wasn't subtle, and he went from acknowledging it to downright annoyed. The last time I went to him to thank him for standing in the way, throwing himself in front of the gun for me, I thought he was going to punch me himself. He said, "Bud, job's the job. The town pays me for it. Don't go mooning over me like the rest of these civs." He blew out his breath and then cut his eyes to me under his craggy eyebrows. "Knock it off or I'll shoot you myself." And I laughed. After a moment, he did too. Because, like they say, about how police end up training a gut instinct to near being able to see the future, well, we also end up with a pretty dark, shared sense of humor. McCurdy, showing me his, finally unclenched that feeling in my own heart and told me that everything was going to be all right. A 1 in a million chance. Isn't it funny? It's not anything you could count on. And yet, can't it be said for so many of these stories? They're all 1 in a million. Butterfly effects. One action, thoughtless or intended to be good, putting in motion something far bigger. Or in this case, the angle and trajectory, something about it turned a bullet from a life ender into a miracle. I do hope you enjoyed the story as much as I enjoy all of you. email, social, liking, commenting, subscribing, and so on and so on. Just know that I am so happy to have spoken with you again. And until next time, stay strange, stay safe, and do take care, strangers.